All right, brothers, welcome to our club meeting for the month of January. And as always, we do our best to bring some light here on this channel and obviously to the brothers out there and to the open world as well, too. So I'd like to present for us as well, Brother Feliciano coming in with his second presentation on the third presentation on the St. James channel here. I urge you all to spend some time, take your notebooks out. This brother's going to have a lot of information to bring to you. It's going to populate a ton of questions for you to think about. And as always, brothers, we're going to mute everyone for now, but we will open it up for questions once the presentation is complete. So thank you guys. And Brother Feliciano, the floor is yours.
All right, I'm going to set up right now. All right, so a real quick disclaimer. The views and opinions expressed in this video do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of New York or any Masonic body in which I hold membership in. Today, we're going to be talking about Clandestine Masonry Part 3, the National Grand Lodge PHO. So in our last presentation, we left off with, does PHO have lineage to the African 459? This is a big question when talking about the National Grand Lodge. But we have to come into understanding of certain questions first before we can answer this question. Does the current National Grand Lodge have continued existence post 1878? Very important question. We also have to talk about how does Masonic law play a role in this whole situation? And lastly, did Grand Lodges have the right to leave the National Compact and merge with the independent Grand Lodges of their state? So real quick, in 1847, we talk about the beginning when this all started. It started with in Pennsylvania with two lodges that were expelled from the first independent African Grand Lodge, and they went and started Hiram Grand Lodge. The two lodges were Harmony and Union Lodge, and they were both expelled as I just stated. They claimed to have received charters from a Grand Lodge in Chillicothe, Ohio. The problem was there was no recognized Grand Lodge in existence in that city at that time. So because of this, both the independent African Grand Lodge and Hiram Grand Lodge had issues, and they went back and forth for months regarding this. There was a lot of beef between the two. Then in June in 1847, we have Hiram Grand Lodge, the first independent African Grand Lodge, and African Grand Lodge of Boston, created a National Grand Lodge with John T. Hilton as their first National Grand Master. A meeting was called by John T. Hilton. African Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, First Independent African Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania, and Hiram Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania were all part of this meeting, along with delegates from Boyer Lodge of New York, which was chartered by African Grand Lodge, but at the moment was independent. They were an independent lodge at that time. While the National Grand Lodge was proposed in 1847, it was not officially established until June of 1848. This is very, very important, as later on when I start talking about our Grand Lodge, 1840 is a very important year for our Grand Lodge, and how it coincides and has to do with the National Grand Lodge. In 1849, in Pennsylvania, 7 lodges that were a part of the Right Worshipful Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania leave the National Compact and create their own Grand Lodge. Now, Right Worshipful Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania was a merger of Hiram Grand Lodge and First Independent African Grand Lodge. Those 7 lodges were Union Lodge, Shaba Lodge, Fidelity Lodge, Harmony Lodge, Prudence Lodge, Christian Lodge, and Paxton Lodge. And if you notice, both Union and Harmony were both that left originally, also left this one time again. Grandmaster Jacob Jenkins and the lodges were expelled from the National Grand Lodge after this. In 1869, you saw Ohio and DC do the same thing. They went to their respective states and left the National Grand Lodge and created their own. In 1877, we had the Pittsburgh Convention where George Levier makes himself the National Grand Master. After his resignation from of Richard Gleaves, George Levier, the National Grand Lodge secretary, calls for a National Grand Lodge session and illegally appoints himself the National Grand Master. The National Deputy Grand Master, L.G. Goggins, was supposed to be next in line. After this, Grand Lodges refused to send representations to further meetings as a retaliation. Now, I want you to understand something. When we look at this whole timeline, understand that the whole purpose of the National Grand Lodge was to combat clandestine masonry and to share intel amongst all the lodges under one roof. Problem was, the National Grand Lodge started getting wanted more power, and they wanted to tell the Grand Masters what to do. And this is the reason why you saw Pennsylvania leave and Ohio and DC leave, because under the rules of regularity, the Grand Lodge is supposed to be sovereign. Nobody tells the Grand Lodge what to do but the Grand Master. That's just how it works. That's how regularity works. That's how it's always been. And originally, it was supposed to be that way, where the Grand Lodges had their own sovereignty, but things got out of control. And as you see in 1877, things got even further out of control. In 1878, it's a big date when it comes to the National Grand Lodge, because then you have the Delaware Convention. This is where ratifications were put in place to dissolve the National Grand Lodge, and every state with 2 Grand Lodges were to merge into one. Now, what you saw in this convention was, it wasn't a session. It was just like the beginning in 1847, when they held the convention and formed the National Grand Lodge. It's the same exact thing, where they had a convention and they disbanded. A meeting was called where following 10 states were represented in the meeting: California, Delaware, Florida, Georgia, Illinois, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Mississippi, and Virginia. The 2/3 of the craft present votes to dissolve the National Compact. So that means that 2/3 of whoever's there are the ones that voted to get rid of the National Compact. Now, one big thing you have to understand, notice I named the states, I didn't name the actual Grand Lodges. There's a reason for that. Because in this meeting, you actually didn't just have the you didn't just have the Grand Lodges that were under the National Compact. You also had the independent Grand Lodges that were sovereign. All of these were a part of this meeting. If you look at number 10 of the ratification, it reads, and Grand Lodges under the National Grand Lodge and independent Grand Lodges each solemnly pledge ourselves to obey these articles, and we recommend that the National Grand Lodge do these articles are approved by 2/3 of the Grand Lodge, wind up its affairs and adjourn sine die. Sorry. That means, plain and simple, that they all voted and it came out that we want to disband this and we're ending the National Grand Lodge. If you look at number 12 of the ratifications, it says, we further recommend that all such Grand Lodges as may be located within the same territorial limits as soon as possible unite and form one Grand Lodge. So understand, at this point right here, with this ratification, now you're talking about merging and leaving the National Grand Lodge. At this point, when you merge and you leave, that Grand Lodge becomes a new Grand Lodge, not under the National Grand Lodge no more. What you see here are the 13 ratifications, and this was found on the 12th annual communication of the Most Worshipful Grand Lodge of Illinois. And if you look at every article, it pretty much tells you what was discussed in that meeting. In 1879, in December, this is what I call the nail in the coffin, because 4/5 of the Grand Lodges and associated with the National Grand Lodge ratify and merge, and they leave the National Grand Lodge. George Levier in December calls for another meeting in Delaware, because he was trying to offset and make sure that this was not happening. George Levier, G.W. Daniels, both from Tennessee, William D. Matthews from Kansas, and S.V.B. Carty from Delaware were present for this meeting. Problem was, to open a meeting with the National Grand Lodge under their constitution, you need 5 or more Grand Lodges. If you notice, there's only 3 Grand Lodges represented here. So according to the general regulations, Article 4 of the 1874 Constitution of the National Grand Lodge, it states the representatives of 5 Grand Lodges convened on due notice shall be indispensably necessary to open or transact business in the National Grand Lodge. This is important because what happens here is in this meeting, SVB Cardi writes what happens in this meeting and shares it with everybody. And I'm going to share that with you right now. This is the first page. If you notice in this first page, it reads, in the person of William Dean Matthews, that as soon as 2/3 of the Grand Lodges here represented ratified in the doings of the convention, the National Grand Lodge shall wind up her affairs and be declared no more. So understand that he's acknowledging the fact that the ratification is actually meant to disband and actually be no more. Then he also says something else. He says in less than 1 year, 4/5 of the Grand Lodges had ratified the doings of the convention and claimed to have sovereign power in their respective jurisdictions. So understand that he's acknowledging that they left. That's what this first page says. When you go on to another page, this is a very important one because listen to what he says about William Matthews. After looking at the law, they found it necessary to have representation from at least 5 state Grand Lodges. So here they're acknowledging their constitution. Then it says, but the great line in the West, Matthews, rose to their relief and said they could go on. No one on the outside world would know anything. So now you got Matthews sitting here standing up saying, oh, we're going to move on and do this meeting illegally. In filling the stations, they found there was no Grand Secretary. William D. Matthews offered me to act as Grand Secretary. This I declined on the grounds that I was neither representative nor member. And according to the law of the National Grand Lodge, I could not take part in any of these proceedings for that body. To this, Matthews answered and said, it would make no difference as we are one family. So now you clearly see the credibility of William D. Matthews when it comes to him doing business for the National Grand Lodge. This is important because between 1880 and 1888, you have no Grand Lodge proceedings. All you have no National Grand Lodge proceedings. All you have is newspaper articles where Matthews sits there and says that, oh, we met, doesn't go into detail about who was there, doesn't go into detail about anything. It just says that we met in a fancy way. His credibility is no good, just based on this alone. In 1882, we see something crazy going on in Tennessee. George Levier, he becomes part of the merger between the Union Grand Lodge, which is the Compact Grand Lodge, and the Independent Grand Lodge, which is the Sovereign Grand Lodge. This is important because in 1882, it was recorded that George Levier, National Grand Master of PHO from 1877 to 1886, was part of a committee of merging the 2 Grand Lodges. How are you the National Grand Master and yet part of a committee to merge the 2 Grand Lodges? This further proves there was no National Grand Lodge there, because the National Grand Master, why would you do that? Or why would you allow that to happen? Tennessee is no longer associated with the National Grand Lodge and further ratifies set forth from 1878. If George Levier was still National Grand Master after this, it violated one of their articles where it says that every officer and member of the National Grand Lodge must be a member of a subordinate lodge within the jurisdiction of the National Grand Lodge. Remember what I said earlier. When the merger happens, you have a new Grand Lodge that is not associated with the National Grand Lodge. So George Levier is a part of another Grand Lodge not under the National Compact. According to the National Grand Lodge, George Levier never stopped his duties as National Grand Master, but they have no record of him being a part of a Grand Lodge under the National Grand Lodge between the years of 1833 and 1886. This right here is from the 1883 proceedings of the Grand Lodge of Tennessee. And you can clearly see that after the merger, it says Meridian Lodge number 8, Knoxville, Tennessee, George W. Levier, treasurer. He was a part of this new Grand Lodge. In 1883, George Levier gets suspended. So George Levier is suspended from the merger, after the merger, for unmasonic conduct. So if you look at the years 1883 to 1886, he was suspended, and there is no other record of him being part of any other Grand Lodge during this time. This is very important because under the articles, if he was National Grand Master between 1883 and 1886, that means that he's violating the rules. Right here is from the 1883 proceedings of the Grand Lodge of Tennessee that proves that he was suspended for unmasonic conduct. So from 1886 to 1888, you see a reorganization from William D. Matthews, who appoints himself the National Grand Master and sets to reestablish the National Grand Lodge. William D. Matthews appoints himself the new National Grand Master in 1886. In 1888, he writes his famous manifesto, where he says, "I therefore give each state, Grand Lodge, subordinate lodge, and lodges in such open rebellion until the 8th day of March, 1888, to return their allegiance and to report to the National Grand Secretary. Failing to comply with this order, I shall commission Grand Masters with full power and authority in those rebellious states to organize Grand Lodges according to the precedent which was laid down in 1733. So you start seeing William D. Matthews from 1880 all the way down to his death really take full control of the situation and try to make something that it's not. William D. Matthews started to recruit suspended and expelled Prince Hall Masons. In 1897 in DC, Dorsey Seville formed Eureka Grand Lodge in DC. Dorsey Seville, for those who don't know, was expelled from the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of DC in 1897 for the same Masonic crimes as John G. Jones. Dorsey Seville then started Eureka Grand Lodge in DC with PHO as their National Grand Master. A matter of fact, no, that he was their Grand Master for that Grand Lodge. William D. Matthews and Dorsey Seville then absorbed the Supreme Council of Sovereign Expecting Generals, 33rd last degree of the United States, and then renames it the National Supreme Council. Okay. Dorsey Seville was also the Sovereign Grand Commander to the National Supreme Council from 1897 to 1911. In 1910, a lawsuit between Jones and the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of DC, Jones said under oath there was a rumor that the rumor of Romania granting a charter to John G. Jones affiliated Grand Lodges was a lie, and that lie was started by Seville. So you see that Seville and John G. Jones had a falling out, and that's the reason why he went to PHO. In 1921, you see the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Ohio take the National Grand Lodge to court. And this is very important because this would details so much stuff that happened. It was determined that upon question as to whether or not the year of 1877 or 1878, the National Grand Lodge ceased to exist or adjoined sine die. There is a divergence of evidence in the evidence. However, this may be, it clearly appears from the weight of the evidence that there was a hiatus for 11 or 12 years in the operation and functions of said National Grand Lodge. This was reported in this court case. And this is important because even the court system is acknowledging that there was no continued existence. So now, when we talk about the National Grand Lodge, what does our jurisdiction have to do with it? In 1847, Boyer Lodge had agreed to be a part of the National Grand Lodge, or delegates from Boyer Lodge agreed to be a part of it. they did not have, but the delegates did not have the authority to these terms on behalf of the lodge. Alexander Elston, member of Boyer Lodge, was appointed a National Grand Lodge officer at this convention, and that title, that National Grand Lodge title, was not recognized by the members of Boyer Lodge. What I have here is who was at this meeting, because they all signed and their names on there, and you can see clearly right here under New York, it states Alexander Elston, William H. Clark, and Lewis Hayden. In 1848, United Grand Lodge was formed. On March 15, 1848, Boyer Lodge number 1, Celestial number 2, and Rising Sun number 3 all formed the United Grand Lodge of New York. While the convention happened in 1847, the Grand Lodges involved did not ratify until June 1848. This is coming from a court case of United Grand Lodge FAM of Maryland versus William Green of 1920. The 1847 convention in Boston was adjourned for these delegates to take the proposed formation of the National Grand Lodge back to their respective Grand Lodges for discussion and mutual deliberation. This source comes from Matthew Brock from the History of the National Grand Lodge. Now, this is important because what you have to understand is when you have a convention and what's supposed to happen with something of that magnitude, this is pretty much like the Prince Hall Conference of Grand Masters. You have this convention where everybody meets, but no decisions are made. The only decisions that are made is we're going to take this back to our Grand Lodges, whatever it is that's voted on, and then those Grand Lodges have to vote on whether they're going to take these and adopt it to their Grand Lodge. In this case, it further proves that's exactly what happened. They all went to this convention in 1847. They met, they talked, and then they went back to their Grand Lodges, let the craft know about it, let the craft vote on it, and then in June of 1848 is when you saw them officially start. So our Grand Lodge was started before the National Grand Lodge. Okay? This is important because there's a lot of stuff that happens in 1848 where they try to sit there and say that Boyer Lodge, Celestial, and Rising Sun were part of lodges that were part of the National Grand Lodge. That's false. Okay. A report from the committee in 1848 and the formation report from 1849, United Grand Lodge of New York Grand Session shows that they published their decision to not accept the charter from the National Grand Lodge and move independently. United Grand Lodge did not host a session in New York in June 1848, as they were not established when the decision to host in New York was made. So understand that they had this convention in 1847. It's at that moment where they discussed when the next meeting is going to be and where. United Grand Lodge of New York was not formed at that time to sit there and say that they held a session and hosted a session for the National Grand Lodge. That makes no sense. So in 1849, the National Grand Lodge then, quote unquote, expels United Grand Lodge. This is important because United Grand Lodge of New York was charged in violation of Article 9 for violating Article 9 of the Articles of Union, in that they do not hold a warrant from the National Grand Lodge. In accusatory instrument written by Joshua and Woodland's committee, the first charge stated that United Grand Lodge of New York did not recognize the National Grand Lodge. The second charge stated it did not possess a warrant from the National Grand Lodge. Article 7 of the Articles of Union allow a Grand Lodge not to form by the National Grand Lodge to apply and, if found worthy, be accepted into membership. So when you put these all together, to be a part of the National Grand Lodge, you would have to apply to the National Grand Lodge. The National Grand Lodge, according to their report, clearly states they did not have a warrant. So if you did not have a warrant, that means you never applied. If you never applied, you are not a member of the National Grand Lodge. It doesn't get any more simpler than this. Article 9 of the Articles of Union of the National Grand Lodge states, no state Grand Lodge of color shall be taken into fellowship with the National Grand Lodge or be considered legal which does not hold a warrant under the National Grand Lodge. In 1849, later on that year, members who did not like the fact that United was not a part of the National Grand Lodge leave United. Mind you, it wasn't that many. Okay, and they formed Grand Lodge of New York under the National Grand Lodge. So you have 6 lodges at that point that left. You have members from Celestial, Hiram, Meridian, King Solomon, Eureka, and Union. It wasn't that many that left because we were still able to operate. In 1877, the most worshipful Grand Lodge of most ancient and honorable fraternity of free and accepted Masons of the state of New York was formed. In 1877, you saw United and Union merge. At that time, they were known as what were the most worshipful Grand Lodge of New York, FAAYM. In 1983, you saw PHO reestablished in New York under they call themselves the most worshipful Grand Lodge of New York State of free and accepted York Rite Masons in 1883. And this is according to the New York State Registry, DOS ID number 850066. This is public record. So what you have here is the 1851 Proceedings of United Grand Lodge of New York, where it clearly, you can see it says, it clearly says that. But if you look at further pages, it says, set forth that she was formed AD 1848 and AL 5848 by a union of 3 Master Mason lodges meeting in convention by a previous agreement with independent powers and having sole right of organizing color lodges and making laws for the government of the craft under one jurisdiction. The next page, adopted at the annual meeting of the United Grand Lodge of the state of New York, June 20th, AL 5848, ordered to be published AL 5850. So now we have to answer these questions. Does the current National Grand Lodge have continued existence post 1878? No, as most of the Grand Lodges under the National Grand Lodge voted to disband the National Grand Lodge in 1878. According to the lawsuit of 1921, it clearly states that the National Grand Lodge was absent for a decade. And there is no National Grand Lodge from 1880 to 1889 to prove that the National Grand Lodge continued existence. Only newspaper articles, which is written by William D. Matthews, and which I've proven is not credible, to make it look like they were still meeting. How does Masonic law play a role when it comes to the National Grand Lodge? The National Grand Lodge goes against the rules of regularity in which that Grand Lodge is the Grand Lodge is sovereign and has self-governing authority upon lodges and its jurisdiction with full undeniable control across the craft and symbolic degrees. So the Grand Lodges under the National Grand Lodge are not sovereign. They report to the National Grand Master. And lastly, it also goes against Albert Mackey's definition of clandestine masonry in History of Freemasonry, which is also used by many Grand Lodges, as several men that take it upon themselves to establish a lodge and call themselves Freemasons without an authority of a Grand Master's approval. William D. Matthews did so after he appointed himself the National Grand Master and reformed the National Grand Lodge. Did the Grand Lodges have the right to leave the National Compact and merge with the independent Grand Lodges of their state? Yes, as per their own constitution, it was voted on by 2/3 of the Grand Lodge present to disband the National Grand Lodge, and that every compact Grand Lodge was to merge with the independent Grand Lodges of their respective state. Mind you, I'm saying yes, because while these were recommendations, they went back to the craft and they followed through and ratified. Also, in 1874, the National Grand Lodge changed its constitution to recognize the Grand Lodges as the highest authority. Does PHO have lineage to African 459? Before 1879, yes, through African Grand Lodge. After 1879, no, because the National Grand Lodge we know now is not the same as the National Grand Lodge that disbanded in 1879. New Grand Lodges were formed, some by expelled Masons, to create this new National Grand Lodge. This concludes my presentation.
Outstanding.
Thank you. Thank you. Any questions? Mikey, you have to unmute yourselves.
Not bad. Very great presentation. No questions, honestly. I learned a lot, as I do anytime I listen to any of your presentations.
Thank you.
So definitely want to thank you for the knowledge. I know you were very excited and wanted to get this out for a long time. So
Oh, yeah.
I'm glad you were finally able to get that out there.
Can you say how long have I had this ready? Because
I think
I've had this ready for how
it was
long?
probably like a couple of months.
Because I've been getting on
So
you
you're waiting on me?
so I could do mine. I needed to put that out there. Just so anybody try to say that I just came up with this. I've had this ready for about maybe 4 or 5 months.
Yeah, it's been a while.
Anybody have any questions?
Definitely well worth the wait.
Thank you.
I really appreciated the timeline because when you get these cats that come up with all of these questions, this, that, and the third, at least you have a timeline linked to significant events that transpired in the craft that shifted in different directions and why, and what those shifts caused in the craft in the area of regular and irregular. So that was really significant for me. Thank you.
When putting this together, one of the biggest things I try to do is simplify everything so that anybody who's listening and watching can really understand what it is that's going on here. Because, it's the best thing to do is if you make it dummy proof, anybody can understand. I think it's honestly, I try to make it as simple as possible.
Yes, sir.
JT, Javon, you got anything to say?
Javon got it quiet.
I know, right? You hear him. He's like, I'm like, has nothing to do with Egypt, so he's trying to stay out.
I don't know. I think you might have been having dinner.
Listen, magnificent presentation, man. I appreciate all the information. I was engaged. I didn't know some of this stuff. But clearly dummy proof. So,
I appreciate that.
but it was great, man, and it can't be disputed. Because you took your time explaining everything.
Thank you.
So appreciate your work ethic in putting this together.
Thank you.
No problem.
Yes, definitely outstanding job. Like always, Josh, outstanding. I know that you do extensive research when it comes to.
I'm going to be completely honest. When it comes to research, I can't take credit. I've been watching and paying attention to the discussions that been happening online. And truthfully and honestly, if you notice, in this presentation at the bottom, I gave credit to everybody who sat there and literally taught me everything that I presented. What I tried to do was put it all together, all this information together so that everybody can see it. So I don't want to take regular research. I don't want to take credit for research because it was actually brothers that taught me, But
it makes sense, and and I did see that, a lot of the names that you get your information from, these are brothers of the craft that
well respected.
Yeah, very well respected. Their work speaks for themselves. So once again, excellent job. I'm constantly learning myself, especially when it comes to PHO and in relations with, PHA, because that's one area that I'm not familiarized with. And then once again, I want to thank you for, putting me in the group because I go on there and just try to soak in and as much as I can because it's not a subject that I'm familiar with.
I appreciate that. Past Master Kelly, Past Master Royal, Past Master Blades. Any comments you would like to make?
Yeah, bro, Secretary. Yeah, I appreciate it too. I'm gonna second piggyback off of Past Master Bank about the timelines and everything, and especially with the senior warden, what he said about the PHO, and because I wasn't familiar with it.
Thank you, Past Master.
Great.
Right. Well, again, I apologize. I am truly impressed, of course, and the knowledge that you have given us, that you have assimilated to us, really puts us in a very important position. Now, the question is, I have to ask, are we considered to be, as a Prince Hall Grand Lodge subordinates, would you be considered to be sovereign at this present time?
We are definitely sovereign, because there's nobody above our Grand Master.
Correct. Okay.
We are definitely sovereign, but them, no.
No. Okay. Excellent. No.
Josh,
job.
as always, good job. It's almost like I'm getting tired of telling you good job, because every time you get a task, man, you knock it out the park. So keep up the good work. And it's always a pleasure learning from even sometimes just chats with you, man.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. Well, brothers, this concludes the portion of the YouTube. I thank you guys for coming, and we're gonna see who's presenting next time. We don't know. We haven't figured that out yet. So thank you very much.